Vampires hunting you, mysterious creatures descending from the moon, ghosts watching kids sleep. These are but a few things you can apparently expect on a visit to Louisiana. Voodoo, swamps, gators, and delicious food are but a few things waiting for you down in the bayou. Enjoy these allegedly true scary stories from Louisiana. Remember to send me your scary stories at darkstories.org so I can narrate them. I'm looking for search and rescue stories. Also, check out Freaky Folklore on your favorite podcast app. The Werewolf Halloween special is now up, and you can download it for free using the link in the pinned comment below. The comment of the day comes from a viewer by the username of Dexter St. Jacques. I've listened to all of your stuff, and I'm having compilation withdrawals now. My reply: hey, when I figure out a way to double the length of each episode, I'd be happy to. At the moment, it's really difficult to do much more than half an hour for each episode, because usually I have to match stories to a specific topic. Hopefully I can get to that point one day. Maybe I'll just do more random story assortments. Leave an interesting comment on this episode, and I might reply in a future one. And happy Halloween, everyone. I hope it's a good one and a safe one for you. Now, let's begin. Vampires in New Orleans. From InkChick13. I haven't spoken about this event in many years. I don't know if any of you will find this to be scary or creepy, but for me, experiencing this event firsthand, I was terrified. My parents divorced when I was 6. They decided I'd live with my mom and see my dad every weekend. As early as I can remember, every weekend, we'd spend at least one day with my dad's best friend Mike and his family. Mike had 2 sons. One of them quickly became one of my best friends, and because of the friendship between our fathers, we literally grew up together. When I was around 12, Mike got a job offer he couldn't refuse. He and his family were moving to Mississippi. It was a sad moment for everyone involved. We knew the distance would change everything, and it felt as if we were saying goodbye to our friendship. Less than a year went by. I was then 13, and my dad tells me we're going to visit our friends during my summer break. I was elated. Now, I grew up, because of my dad, fully submerged in all things horror, paranormal, and unknown. Despite my mom's occasional disapproval of allowing me to see certain films that were far beyond my years, she too was and still is a huge believer and fanatic, like my father and I suppose, to put it best, in my Christmas stocking when I was a kid, I got the movie Jason Goes to Heck. It was in VHS, which might show my age. I also got a collection of 4 shot glasses that were made of silicone or rubber, decorated with Michael Myers, Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, and one shot glass was of body parts from their victims. Needless to say, I was raised to embrace my oddball side. However, despite believing in the supernatural, paranormal, and the unknown, I'm not one to blindly believe. With that in mind, my dad told me New Orleans was about a 2-hour drive from Mike's home, and we'd be spending a day or two exploring New Orleans cemeteries, voodoo shops, taking haunted tours, going ghost hunting at midnight, etc. Fast forward to that day. We got a late start when leaving, so by the time we arrived to New Orleans, everyone was hungry, and no one wanted to start exploring on an empty stomach. We found an original Bubba Gump Jambalaya restaurant across the street from a unique gray-reddish brick building that looked like someone took a chunk out of a castle and relocated it. Having a large group, we were seated at a rectangular table against the front of the restaurant, directly next to a massive window that faced the unique building across the way. One head of the table was against the wall. I sat next to the window. My dad was to my right, his now wife to his right. At the head or end of the table was Mike's youngest son, then his eldest, who was my best friend, then Mike, and across from me was Mike's wife. Throughout our lunch, the adults spoke to each other while us kids somewhat sat in silence. Picking up my food, I looked out the window, and I noticed a couple sitting at a round table for 2 in a curved portion of the unique building. I got an unsettling feeling from them, and I found it difficult not to stare. Despite being male and female, they were almost identical, but that wasn't what was off. From the moment I looked at them, they hadn't moved. Both were dressed in light gray t-shirts, had jet black hair, wore 90s style all black plastic sunglasses, and had skin that was, well, I'm extremely fair-skinned, despite having Italian and Sicilian in my ancestry. I can't tan to save my life, but these two, they weren't just white. They were ash gray white. The entire time they sat looking at one another, leaning on their elbows, with a straw in their mouths, sipping from large white mugs. After eating, everyone took turns using the restrooms, while the rest of the party stood outside stretching their legs and letting their food settle. It had been well over an hour since I'd spotted the couple, and still they hadn't moved. I decided to ask my dad about it. It surprised me when he said he didn't notice them as he walked up to the restaurant and had frequently glanced at them during our lunch. My dad had always enjoyed scaring me, although sometimes he took it way too far. It was often in good fun, and that's what he started doing, teasing me. He told me they're vampires, and if they notice me staring at them, they'll make a meal out of me. We were laughing about it when an older gentleman sitting on a bench nearby comes over to us and asks to speak to my dad. He tells my dad that he was more right than he knew. He claimed that tourism has given the beast an opportunity, and with being forced to live in the shadows all their time, they've been taking advantage of the foot traffic lately. He then told my dad to buy a protection spell from a voodoo priestess nearby, and to avoid buying anything from vendors in highly populated areas, because nothing in those shops were real. They were mocks to make money. Then the old man pulled my dad aside and spoke to him in private. I've no clue what he said to my dad, but the look on his face I'll never forget. As the group all came together, my dad held tightly onto my hand and said we needed to make a slight detour. My dad isn't a huge man, but he definitely isn't small. At 5'11", an average of 195 pounds, working out 6 days a week for 5 hours a day and being extremely fast as a minor league baseball player and retired stuntman, he didn't get scared easily. He was the intimidator, but my dad looked worried, and this worried me. While walking away, I looked back at that couple. It was the first time I wish I hadn't, though. In unison, they both turned their heads towards me, pulled their sunglasses down to their noses, and looked at me over the top of their shades. Their eyes, they were something I'll never forget. They were bloodshot. The irises were a color of red I'd never seen before or since, and they smirked at me, revealing a mouth of sharp fangs while licking their lips. It felt as if they were looking into my soul, like they could read my mind, and reacted when a thought of telling my dad came to mind. I was literally thinking of tugging on his hand and telling him they moved for the first time to make eye contact with me. And just as the thought hit me, in unison they both shook their heads, as if to tell me no. I felt what little color I might have had drain from my body. Terrified, I quickly turned away. I had to tell myself not to turn around, but it was of no use. Less than 3 to 4 seconds later, I glanced back once more, but they were gone. That fast, just poof. Regardless of their head shake, I told my dad what happened, and he swooped me up in his arms as if I was a little girl again. I was 13, in my opinion still a little girl, but it felt like I was 5 again. My dad told my stepmother what was happening, and although she felt it was nothing more than locals messing with us, she still did as my dad asked, to keep an extra eye on me. Although the couple had vanished, I still felt as if I was being watched. I felt like what I assume a paranoid addict would feel like, turning my head this way and that non-stop. I kept catching glimpses of them out of the corner of my eyes as we walked to our destination. Behind every corner, pillar, door, and building, and down every alleyway, I would see them, but every time I'd turn to face them, they would be gone. My dad, by this time, had put me down and made my stepmother hold one hand while he held the other. Years later, I found out that he too kept seeing them. He felt their eyes watching, and whether the thought was planted or true, he felt their strong desire to take me. It took almost 25 or 30 minutes to find the voodoo shop the local had suggested, and along the way my dad had asked other locals of its authenticity. The shop was away from everyone, down several back alleys and streets, located in the side of an old brick building. The air surrounding the place felt different. It was heavy and foreboding. However, the closer we got, the more the air cleared, as if there was a force field surrounding the building, a protection spell of sorts. As we walked up, a lady came out, startling us. Dressed in things I've never seen before, she said, "Come, come, I have what you need." She scurried back into her shop. It was dark inside. My eyes had a hard time adjusting to the limited candle glow. I could have spent an hour in there and still wouldn't have seen everything. There were bones of different colors, shapes, and sizes all over, and old jars full of different materials, from powder to dust to feathers to gelatinous goo. Books covered the walls and scattered about. There were crystals, tarot cards, animal parts, shawls, skulls, candles, shafts, and the sort. The woman stood beside a table, grinding and mixing things in a wooden bowl, when she comes over and pricks my finger without warning. Despite me saying, "Ouch," no one had said anything. Squeezing my finger, she puts a few drops of my blood into the wooden bowl, mixing everything into a red powder, and puts it into a small clear vial on a thin rope-like string, and tells me, once tying it around my neck, that I cannot take it off until I arrive back home. The woman, staring intensely into my eyes, tells my dad and I can see why the vampires have chosen you. Your energy is alluring. Beware, this will stop them from feeding, but it won't stop their attraction. This will upset them. You've been warned. Everyone else had stayed outside. When we came out, they were curious about what we'd bought, thinking it was another novelty magic-themed shop. My dad said I'd wanted a vampire protection spell, playing it off as if it was nothing. When we made our way back to the tourist-filled streets, my dad and I stopped in our tracks. Standing in the middle of the street, not moving, but facing us, was the couple. They looked angered, their eyes looking at my necklace and back at my dad and I. You could actually feel the anger oozing off of them. It was sickeningly strong and started to upset my stomach. No one else seemed to notice them, and continued with their chatter and exploration of the area. The rest of the day seemed normal, despite the occasional feeling of being watched or followed. My dad and I felt the necklace prevented something bad from happening, but whether that was planted false security or the truth, I'll never know. Whether vampires exist and those two were actually vampires who found me alluring, I'll also never know. The only things I do know was I felt pulled to the couple unlike anything I'd ever felt. I've had a life full of bizarre, unexplainable paranormal events. My energy interferes with electronics, including streetlights, and although the voodoo lady knew why we were there, no one had actually told her. What I don't understand is how. Demonic Haunting from Wookie. Given that it's been a few years now, it's difficult to remember all the details. Granted, I still remember quite a lot, and I'll never forget that day. It was my junior/senior year of college in North Louisiana. I lived with my girlfriend, across from the local over 150-year-old cemetery. I was struggling with being burnt out with school and borderline alcoholism. The latter still persists, but has decreased significantly since. I decided I was going to be involved with the church again, for the first time since I was a kid. My girlfriend somewhat respected my decision, but still would joke that I was taking it too seriously. A few months passed, and she began to become curious about my newfound faith. She had left the church and thought all conventional religious thought was stupid. She began discussing with me my thoughts on her trying out other religions and such, and I told her it was no big deal, as she's entitled to her own choice. All continued on as normal. Well, as normal as it can be, with me being ostracized to the couch or the other bedroom due to my alcohol-induced snoring and nightly reading my Bible. I drank a lot back then. One evening, I was close to being off work, and she called me during a break freaking out. I asked what was wrong, and she told me she had practiced a meditation ritual she found online to, quote-unquote, open her third eye to the spirit world. And even though she never really expected anything to happen, something actually answered. A couple of hours pass, and I get home to her having dinner ready. She and the dog are both waiting to eat on the porch, rather than inside the house, which was normal, so I was already noticing the red flags. I greet her, and she carries on conversation like normal. However, I noticed our dog is just staring at the corner of the porch, instead of begging for food like he usually did. I also noticed she would keep glancing in that direction as well for no apparent reason. I finally asked her in a tone that conveyed my disdain for her call earlier that evening. "So what'd you do that I told you was a bad idea?" She told me more about her meditation and how nothing worked the first 2 tries, but on the 3rd try, she had heard a voice. She said she immediately freaked out and went to go cook dinner. As she was cooking, she felt as though someone was in the room with her. She turned around to see a shadow in the middle of the room, stretching from the floor almost to the ceiling. She left with the dog and drove a few laps around the block before she felt like coming back. All was normal now, aside from the fact that she and our dog apparently could see the figure near us as we ate. She continued to tell me he was a teenager that had lived there previously and had died in a car accident. I was already very upset at the fact something had frightened her, and it really drove the feeling of anger home that my dog also seemed to be afraid. I asked her if the boy said anything else, and her response was, "He's been here for a long time and has tried to talk to you. He says your taste in TV is great." The statement sent a chill down my spine, as I'd usually be up well past the time she'd go to bed, watching TV alone. And late at night I would always watch shows about hauntings or possessions. The comment caused me to instantly feel extremely uncomfortable, and I snapped, saying, "Well, tell him that I said he's not a person, nor was he ever a person. It's only pretending to gain some kind of trust." I also followed up with, "Well, tell it I don't want it in my home, and it is not welcome here." She paused for a moment, and I noticed she and the dog looked towards the exact same spot, now closer to me than the corner, and she said, "He's not happy now. He says you'll come around though, and you'll be able to talk to him too." She continued with, "He seems nice. He loves playing with the dog and keeping him company." That was another statement that chilled me to the bone, since I've come home early from class or work before to find the dog out of his crate, with no explanation or anything as to how he not only got out, but also how he could have opened a door to get out of the bedroom while we were gone. Long story short, this type of stuff kept happening with my girlfriend waking up with bruises and scratches, and me too on occasion. We would both have horrible nightmares. I routinely had sleep paralysis almost every night for 2 to 3 months. The house seemed colder than normal even though we had terrible AC in the summer. It came to the point where both of us would argue, and we would feel instantly angry or depressed as soon as we'd just walk inside. One day my girlfriend was gone to work. I decided I was going to skip class and just drink away the overwhelming sadness and fear I was feeling in my own home. So there I sat on the porch with the dog, drinking vodka, when I decided that I'd had enough with not feeling safe in my own home. I remembered what my family had always taught me growing up, coming from several grandfathers being pastors. I had decided I was going to attempt a somewhat tipsy exorcism. Up until this point, I know this sounds like the worst idea ever, but there I went. I blessed water in a red Solo cup, prayed, and chose to go back into the house, even though I didn't want to be in there in the slightest. My dog began growling and whimpering as soon as I opened the door, so I told him to stay there. He was a 110-pound Great Pyrenees, so a very protective and massive dog. But this dog was terrified to go in the house at that moment. He also hadn't gone into one room in particular to even get a toy or anything in months. I walked in and instantly felt as though 200 pounds was pushing down on my chest. I could feel no hope for anything good to ever happen in the world. I felt like somebody or something was angry and absolutely hated me and wanted to hurt me. Then random things began moving and falling off shelves and tables. By the time I got to the very back room where the meditation had occurred, aka Ground Zero, I was shivering from the cold I felt. It was over 100 degrees outside, and we had the worst AC imaginable, and yet I could see my breath. I'm now a Marine, and I've been deployed, and I've never in my entire life felt such fear, not how I felt it that day. I walked into that room, blessed it, heard the last rattle of furniture or whatever else was in there, and suddenly, it didn't feel cold anymore. It felt like the weight was finally lifted. For the first time in months, my home felt happy, not depressing or oppressive. I couldn't believe I actually pulled it off. As a test, I opened the door, and my dog came running right in, excited as ever, not a care in the world. My girlfriend came home from work a couple of hours later and asked what I did differently upon stepping into the house. She said, "It just feels so much better in here." To this day, about 5 years later, I still can't believe I followed through with that half-drunk plan to square up with some kind of demonic entity and actually come out on top. The Three Entities. From Lovely Now 49. This is my mother's story. She was born in New Orleans, Louisiana, but she grew up in the southeastern part of the state. My mother told me a story about when she was a little girl. She was around 11 years old when she said this event took place. But first, for a bit of backstory. My mother didn't always stay with her parents, as they worked a lot, so she lived with her grandmother. But occasionally she would visit them, and it was on one of those occasions that this happened. One night my mother, her younger brother who was 10, and her sister who was 7 were all playing this game to see who could stay up the longest. Well, her little sister fell asleep first, and so it was just her and her little brother left in the competition. At the time, my grandparents' house was facing the highway, and across the street was one of their relatives' houses. He was an older gentleman whose name my mother couldn't remember. My mother and her brother were still in competition, and they were both looking up at the moon because of how big and beautifully bright it was. As they watched the moon, they saw something their little minds couldn't comprehend. In the moonlight, they saw 3 entities floating down from the sky. They were dressed in all white, and they were holding what appeared to be umbrellas. There were 2 men and 1 woman. When their feet touched the ground, they headed straight for the relative's house that lived across the street. They walked through a small gate, then up to the front door, without actually touching either of those things. My mother and her brother were shocked at what they saw, but once they snapped out of it, they both ran to tell their parents, who of course did not believe them. The next morning, when an aunt of my mother's went to check on the relative, she screamed in horror when she found him dead. My mother's parents then believed her and her brother's story about the 3 entities. Adding on to the story, a commenter by the username The Supernatural Scribe replied, "Your post reminds me of my mother-in-law's story. When she was a little girl in the backwoods of eastern Kentucky, one night she saw a woman floating down from the sky with an umbrella. She always told us that she had not even heard of Mary Poppins either. I don't know if there was a death after what she saw, but it sounds very similar to your story. I saw a ghost. From Story Guy. I was in 3rd grade when this happened. I had a friend who went by Bear. His family was pretty well off, and they had a big, nice house. Bear had 2 older sisters, much older, T and S. At school, he told me that his house was a hospital during the Civil War, and that there were a lot of spirits in it. He said he could see them sometimes, and that he could talk to them with his Ouija board. He said it's okay, because there were good ones that protected him from the bad ones. Being in 3rd grade, I didn't even know what a Ouija board was, and I didn't think much of or care about the spirits. Even so, going to his house was a lot of fun for me, because his family was really nice. They had a Nintendo, a 4-wheeler, a creek where you could dig up old glass medicine bottles. Just about everything a 3rd grade boy would find amazing. Plus, I didn't even have an understanding of the paranormal. So we were at his house. His older sister S was in New Orleans for the weekend, and T was somewhere else. So it was just us and his parents. It had gotten to be pretty late, and we were in the upstairs living room playing Nintendo when it began to turn off and come back on its own. It did that a few times, and Bear said it was time to go to bed, so he went off to his room. I stayed there, trying to get the Nintendo to work again. After a minute or so, he opened his door and very insistently told me to come on. So I did. When I got into his room, he closed the door and started to stack his books in front of it. I didn't understand why he was doing that, but he told me to help him, so I listened. We emptied his bookshelf and toy box in a pile against his bedroom door. He pulled the trundle for me and we got in bed. There was a window right next to his bed, so the outside light dimly lit the room. We were lying there talking and laughing for a while, when all of a sudden his bathroom door opened. He rolled over to face the window and told me to be quiet and to go to sleep. I didn't know what was going on, but then I could hear him crying, so I sat up and looked at him. I can still see his face lit by the light from the window. Tears were dropping from his nose. He was just staring out the window. He told me again to lie down and to go to sleep, seeming aggravated or angry. So I rolled back over and lay down, facing the bathroom. I was lying there for a few seconds when this blonde-haired woman came out of the bathroom and sort of glided to within 3 feet of me and just stood there. I could tell she was blonde and was wearing white, but I could not see any facial features. It was like there was a dim light behind her, and I could only see her outline, and everything inside the outline was dark. I could see strands of blonde hair sticking out. It's not like she was looking at me. She wasn't bent over or anything, just standing straight up, looking straight ahead. I've always felt like she was more or less presenting herself to me. I don't know why, but that's how it feels. So she's standing there, and I ask, S? Bear whispered, "That is not S. Go to sleep." It was around then that she turned around and kind of slid back into the bathroom. The whole encounter lasted maybe 15 seconds from her coming in to her leaving again. She had stood there for maybe 5 seconds or so. That didn't scare me, though. I was more confused than anything, and shortly after that, I went to sleep. The next morning, we were getting ready to go to church, and I began to run a bath. I turned on the light and water, then went to Bear's bedroom when I heard the water go off. Bear heard it too. We went back into the bathroom and turned it on. Then we walked back into his room, and it went off again. So Bear decided against his bath. He hurried downstairs instead into the dining room. His mom had just cooked breakfast, and we were all sitting at the table eating when water began to drip from the ceiling. Then it started to pour. We ran upstairs to see that the water had come back on. The bathroom was flooded. His parents were furious. They were screaming at me, blaming me for it. Bear and I were both crying, telling them that it wasn't my fault, but they wouldn't listen. They took me home, and that was the last time I was welcomed there.